April 28, 1945. 14:20 hours on a country road outside Lübecken, the north of Germany. Senior helper Greta Hoffmann stood in the pouring rain with 43 other women who belonged to the German Air Force Signal Corps, watching big British tanks roll right past their exact location. Her hands were shaking, but not from the cold, even though the April rain had completely soaked through her military uniform, but from a deep terror of what was going to happen next to them. All around her, some of the younger women were crying very quietly to themselves. One girl, who was barely 18 years old, kept saying over and over, "Bitte nicht, bitte nicht," which means, "Please no, please no," as if a simple prayer might somehow change the terrible thing that was about to happen. The German stories had been very clear and detailed. Nazi officers who were running away, just ahead of the British advance, had told all of them exactly what they should expect from being captured. They would face shame, bad treatment, and being put down. They were told the enemy soldiers were rough, wild people who would treat German women with the same kind of meanness their stories claimed was just a natural part of the British Empire. Some of the women had been given small poison capsules, and several had already swallowed them right away, rather than face the thought of being captured. Greta herself had thrown her own capsule away, because she could not bring herself to commit suicide. But now she seriously wondered if throwing it away had been the completely wrong choice. A British sergeant walked slowly toward them, his rifle hanging loosely over his shoulder. His uniform was completely wet, but he stood up straight and tall. He was probably about 30 years old, and he looked very tired and worn out. When he spoke, his German had a very strong accent, but his words were clear and easy to understand. "You are now prisoners of war, and you will be treated correctly and fairly. No one here will harm you at all." Greta stared hard at him, completely unable to understand the calm and professional way he spoke to them. This was absolutely not what she had been promised. Where was the great rage, the terrible revenge? The cruelty that the Nazi officers had so strongly assured her would come from these men whose cities Germany had bombed so heavily and whose brave soldiers Germany had killed in battle. The sergeant pointed with his hand toward some trucks that were waiting nearby, their engines running slowly. "You will all be transported to a processing center where you will be registered. You will receive food and medical attention. Is anyone here wounded who needs immediate care right now?" One of the women slowly raised a trembling, shaky hand. The sergeant quickly called over a medic, who came up with a field first aid kit, and began to carefully examine the woman's injured arm with gentle skill and competence, speaking very softly in English, while he cleaned and bandaged the wound. When he was completely finished, he offered the woman a chocolate bar that he took from his own food pack. Greta Hoffmann began to truly understand that everything she had been told by her leaders was a lie, and that sudden realization, standing there in the cold rain on a German road in the very final days of the German government, was even more shocking than the moment of capture itself. The women of the German army. By the year 1945, the Nazi German government had called up and put into service hundreds of thousands of women to fill many different military helper jobs. This was a necessity that came from the total war's huge and never-ending need for more people to serve. The change had been slow and gradual, and also full of contradictions. The official Nazi way of thinking said that a woman's most important place was always in the home, having children for the country and keeping the house safe, while the men went out to fight the war. But their ideas had to give way to what was needed. As more and more people were hurt or killed and the shortage of men became very serious, women began to fill jobs as clerks, radio operators, crews for searchlights, helpers for anti-aircraft guns, nurses, and staff for administrative offices. These jobs were first called helper roles to keep up the false idea that women were not truly a part of the military. But these jobs became more and more impossible to tell apart from regular military service as the war continued. By 1943, about 500,000 German women were serving in many different helper groups. The Army helper supporting Army operations, the Air Force helper working with the Air Force, the Navy helper attached to the Navy, and many other civilian groups that were doing military work. They wore military uniforms, they lived on military bases, and they worked in areas where fighting was happening, and they faced the same kinds of dangers as the male soldiers. When the Allied bombers attacked German cities, or when the front lines suddenly collapsed and the helper units found themselves right in the middle of combat areas, these women received training that lasted from a few weeks to several months, depending on the specific jobs they had. Radio operators learned Morse code and the proper ways to communicate with others. Anti-aircraft crews were trained on the fire control systems and how to correctly recognize enemy targets. Nurses received medical instruction that, while it was much shorter than the training for civilian nurses, prepared them well for the real-life situations of treating soldiers wounded in battle. The training strongly focused on being technically good at the job and following strict rules, which created a group of women who understood military organization and could work very effectively in the difficult conditions of wartime. When the final collapse of the German government came in the spring of 1945, tens of thousands of these women suddenly found themselves in situations that were impossible to handle. The regular German army units were falling apart completely. The command structures had broken down. The roads for running away were cut off or completely blocked by crowds of people trying to escape. The choice that faced many of the helper units was simple. Try to fight back in a useless resistance. Try to escape through the terrible chaos that was killing thousands of regular people every single day, or simply surrender to the advancing Allied forces. Those who chose to surrender did so with a genuine and deep terror about what would happen next, because they were convinced by years of false stories that being captured meant torture, terrible abuse, and death. The British approach. British forces who were moving through northern Germany in April and May of 1945 began to meet female prisoners of war more and more often, which meant they needed clear guidance on how to handle a situation that many of the commanders had not clearly expected. The guidance, when it finally came from the higher headquarters, showed the deep cultural values about the proper way to behave toward women, no matter what the circumstances were. The orders clearly stated that female prisoners would be treated with the same respect and protection that was given to British servicewomen, and that any abuse or improper behavior toward female prisoners of war would result in a military trial. The orders also stressed that keeping discipline and proper behavior when dealing with captured women was a matter of military honor. This was not just a general idea, it was a very specific instruction that showed how the British Army understood its own identity. Officers and senior non-commissioned officers had been raised in a culture where acting in a way that was not fitting for an officer and a gentleman was one of the most serious charges a person could face, where treating women properly was thought to be a basic part of a civilized society, and where keeping high standards of decency under all circumstances was seen as the thing that separated a civilized society from a savage one. These important values did not just disappear when they met enemy personnel. If anything, they became even stronger, becoming proof that the British forces could keep their moral superiority even when they were dealing with people who had served a government that was clearly evil. Medical officers who treated the female prisoners of war followed the exact same rules they would use for British servicewomen. A careful examination, the appropriate treatment, keeping medical information private, and writing down any injuries or health problems that needed ongoing care. Female medical staff were assigned when they were available to handle situations where male doctors might make the prisoner feel ashamed or embarrassed. The goal was not to make friends or to be easy on them. It was to provide professional medical care that was given without caring about the patient's uniform or their country. The shock of normalcy. The process of handling female prisoners of war followed rules that were designed to create order while causing the least amount of bad feelings and showing that being held captive would be controlled by clear rules rather than by total chaos. Greta. Hoffman's group arrived at a temporary holding facility, which was a German army building that the British forces had taken over and changed into a prisoner of war use on the evening of April 28th. The women were kept separate from the male prisoners, and they were assigned to a secured area with female guards when they were available, or male guards with very strict orders about their behavior when female guards were not available. They went through the standard process, writing down their name, rank, unit, and the date they were captured. A medical checkup, taking away their military equipment and documents, and being assigned to their sleeping barracks. The barracks themselves were very basic, but they were weatherproof wooden buildings with bunks, stoves for heating, and good, clean bathroom facilities. They were not comfortable, but they were also not meant to deliberately punish them. British supply workers gave out blankets, basic cleaning items, and eating kits. When the women lined up for their very first meal as prisoners, they received the exact same food portions that were given to the British troops: tea, bread, canned meat, and vegetables. The amount of food was not huge by normal, peaceful standards, but it was the same amount that the guards were eating, and it was more than many of the women had been receiving in the messy final weeks of the German military falling apart. The mental effect of this was immediate and very deep. These women had spent days or weeks running away, often without enough food, sometimes under enemy fire and always in fear. They had given up expecting immediate horror. Instead, they found themselves in a place that was controlled and orderly, where the guards kept order through their presence and authority rather than through violence, and where their basic needs were met in an organized way, where the immediate terror of being captured gave way to the boring, normal routine of being locked up. Many of them cried, not from sadness, but from a huge feeling of relief, so overwhelming that it caused a physical reaction. The stress that had kept them going through the surrender, through the processing, and through the first hours of being held captive suddenly broke when they realized they were truly safe. British guards, who were faced with dozens of women all breaking down at the same time, responded with an awkward kind of kindness, offering extra tea and extra blankets, and quietly assuring them that they were prisoners but would be treated correctly. Some of the guards, who were veterans of years of fighting, found themselves feeling uncomfortable with the raw emotion, unsure of how to respond to tears after years of the war's harsh and certain realities. Greta Hoffman later remembered that moment as the exact point when the war inside her mind finally ended. The British were not being kind. They were simply being correct and professional. That was the most shocking thing of all. The women were given work assignments that were meant to keep them busy and contribute to the camp's daily life. Many were assigned to the camp's laundry, the kitchen, or to administrative tasks like keeping records and translating documents. This work was not meant to be a punishment. It was meant to be useful and to keep their minds occupied. The guards were strict about the work, but they were also fair. They expected the women to work hard and to follow the rules, but they did not treat them cruelly. This simple, fair treatment was a huge surprise to the women. They had been taught that the enemy would be mean and would try to make them suffer. Instead, they found a system that was orderly and predictable. If they followed the rules, they were treated well. If they broke the rules, they were punished fairly. This was a completely new way of life for them, very different from the way the Nazi government had worked. The Nazi government had used fear and random power to control people. The British used rules and fairness. This was a powerful lesson. The women also had to deal with the other German prisoners, especially the men. The camp held many different kinds of German soldiers, including some very strong Nazi believers, the British. Guards made sure to keep the women safe from any bad treatment by the male prisoners. They knew that the women were more vulnerable and needed extra protection. This protective attitude from the British was another big surprise. The women had been told that the British would be the ones to hurt them. Instead, the British were protecting them from their own countrymen. The guards were not trying to be their friends, but they were treating them with respect. They were treating them as human beings who had rights, even as prisoners of war. This simple, correct behavior slowly started to change the way the women thought about the enemy. They began to see the British soldiers not as monsters, but as professional men who were just doing their job according to a set of high standards. The small acts of decency were everywhere. A guard might share his cigarettes with prisoners during break times. A medic treating a prisoner's infected wound would do it with the same care he would give to a British soldier. An administrative officer would make sure that the prisoner's letters home were sent out quickly so that families in Germany would know their daughters, wives, and sisters were alive and safe. None of these small actions broke any rules or made the camp less safe. They were simply human decency being shown within the limits of the guard-prisoner relationship. Some of the prisoners returned this decency with their own small gestures. German nurses who were working in the Allied medical facilities used their professional skills very well, which the British doctors openly acknowledged. Women who were assigned to farm work learned the British farming techniques and used them very effectively, getting good results that surprised the farmers who had been doubtful and who had expected them to be bad at the job or try to ruin things. Kitchen workers prepared the meals with a care that was more than just following the orders they were given, taking professional pride in their work, even though they were prisoners. The key to slow and steady growth of these normal working relationships did not erase the main fact that they were being held captive or turn enemies into friends, but it created a place where both the guards and the prisoners could keep their dignity, where the daily routine worked through helping each other instead of just through force, where the people on both sides saw that they were all human despite the uniforms and the situations that kept them apart. The unexpected truth. What the German women discovered while being held by the British was not just kindness. It was something much more valuable and something that would last longer. Consistency. The guards did not become friends with the prisoners, but they kept their professional standards high. The officers did not feel sorry for the prisoners' difficult situations, but they made sure that the rules protecting the prisoners' rights were followed. The medical staff did not show special sympathy, but they provided good, professional care without treating anyone differently. The system did not forgive what Germany had done, but it treated each German person according to the rules instead of seeking revenge. This consistency created a place where the prisoners could have a normal routine, where they knew exactly what to expect, and where following the rules resulted in predictable responses rather than random, unfair punishment. It showed that keeping order did not need fear, that discipline could exist without cruelty, and that authority could be kept strong through skill and fairness rather than through violence. For the women who had served a government that worked through fear and random, unfair power, these discoveries were very important. The British did not treat the female prisoners of war with too much sympathy or with special gentleness. They treated them simply as prisoners of war who were entitled to specific rights under international law and under British military rules. They were subject to being locked up and having to work, but they were protected from abuse and were entitled to basic human dignity. That treatment, which was neither mean nor too easy, but simply correct, proved to be more powerful than the German stories, exactly because it was real. It was not a show that was designed to impress anyone. It was how the British forces actually behaved when they were dealing with prisoners, because keeping proper standards was how they understood military professionalism. Years later, when the survivors wrote down their experiences, the most common message was not thanks for special kindness, but a deep appreciation for basic decency at a time when they had expected brutality. They had given up in fear, ready for the horrors that their own stories had described. Instead, they found British soldiers who were professional, often tired and sometimes a little annoyed, but who were fundamentally decent men who kept their standards high because those standards showed who they were, not because they especially cared about German prisoners, but because giving up those standards would mean giving up their own identity as British soldiers. That was the unexpected truth that the German female prisoners of war discovered. The enemy was not especially kind or sympathetic. The enemy was simply civilized, keeping the standards of a civilized society even toward those who had served a government that had completely abandoned such standards. And that civilization shone through thousands of small acts of proper behavior over many months of being held captive, taught them lessons about a working society that no other experience could have provided. The British did not set out to teach the German prisoners about democracy or civilization. They simply kept their standards while they processed and held the enemy people who were waiting to be sent back home. But keeping those standards high under pressure, treating the prisoners correctly, even when revenge would have been easy to understand, and showing that strength included self-control, that became a lesson more powerful than any formal teaching could ever achieve. Empires fall, battles fade into history, but dignity, treating even enemies with basic decency when you have defeated them, keeping your standards high when giving them up would be much easier. Proving through your actions rather than just your words what civilization truly means, that lasts. In 1945, the British forces showed that victory did not require revenge, that strength included self-control, that being a gentleman was not a weakness, but the foundation of a lasting moral authority. German women who had expected shame but received professional, correct treatment learned that lesson right away and carried it forward long after the fences came down and the prisoner of war camps closed. The British had not shown them kindness. They had shown them something much more important, what civilization looked like when it was truly tested. And that made all the difference.